Deep in China's Xinjiang region, on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, archaeologists uncovered bodies that never should have survived intact for 4,000 years. It's one of the harshest deserts on Earth. The dry air, salty soil, and freezing winters preserved hair, eyelashes, and finely woven cloth in eerie, still legible detail, as if the desert had simply paused these people mid-sentence rather than buried them. The dead lay in boat-shaped coffins, wore tall felt hats, and were buried beside strange lumps of dairy that would later turn out to be the oldest cheese ever found. Many had deep-set eyes and high-bridged noses that looked to the archaeologists standing over them, strikingly Western, as if they'd wandered in from the wrong continent and simply never left. For 21 years, that was the entire mystery. These people looked like they came from somewhere else. Then their own DNA said they didn't. Early explorers had reported strange remains in the region since the early 20th century, but it was systematic, patient excavation, decades of it, that revealed how extraordinary the burials actually were. Excavations at the Gumugu Cemetery uncovered some of the earliest Bronze Age burials in the Tarim Basin. Around the same period, archaeologists working near the ancient city of Loulan discovered another remarkable individual, a woman whose face was still intact after roughly 3,800 years, later known as the Beauty of Loulan. Researchers later returned to a site first noted by Swedish archaeologist Folke Bergman in the 1930s and rediscovered the Xiaohe cemetery, an even larger burial complex with no obvious parallel anywhere nearby in ancient China. Instead of the underground chambers and pottery typical of the region, there were carved wooden coffins shaped like boats, sealed under cattle hide, with wooden poles standing above each grave like oars frozen mid-stroke, as if a small fleet had been driven into the sand and left there. Inside, the dead were dressed for a journey. Thick wool coats, plaid textiles, felt boots lined with fur, wooden combs and woven grain baskets tucked in beside them, as though someone expected the afterlife to require packing. Something about these people, their coffins, their whole burial logic, had never fit the country they were buried in. The faces made it stranger still. Tall stature, fair complexions, hair running from light brown to blonde, features that felt out of place 1,000 miles from the nearest coastline. To researchers working in Bronze Age Xinjiang, it looked like the wrong population in the wrong desert. That physical resemblance isn't ancestry, but it was treated for years as the closest thing to proof anyone had. In the year 2000, archaeologists J.P. Mallory and Victor Mayer published a book that would define the debate for the next 2 decades, the Tarim Mummies. Working from the physical evidence available at the time, wool textiles, wheat and barley farming, herded sheep and cattle, they proposed a migration. Maybe the mummies descended from the Afanasyevo culture of the Eurasian steppe. Maybe they were early Tocharian speakers, or connected to the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, an oasis culture linked to Iranian plateau farmers. Every strand of surface evidence, the textiles, the diet, the tall wooden poles, seemed to point west, and it was a genuinely careful piece of scholarship built from the only kind of evidence anyone had access to at the time. Without ancient DNA to test it, that theory became the dominant archaeological interpretation, printed in books, repeated in documentaries, right up until the technology existed to actually ask their bones instead of just their faces. Then, in October of 2021, an international team led by geneticist Fan Zhang published a genome-wide study in Nature that took the question out of the realm of appearance entirely and put it somewhere no book from the year 2000 could have reached. It was the first direct genetic test 21 years of migration theory had ever received. And unlike a felt hat or a wool weave, a genome doesn't care what it resembles or what a viewer standing in a museum might assume from a nose or a hairline. It only reports what's actually there. The team sequenced ancient DNA from 13 individuals from the Tarim Basin, dated to roughly 2100 to 1700 BCE, and 5 individuals from the neighboring Xungarian Basin to the north, dated even earlier, around 3000 to 2800 BCE. The Tarim individuals carried no significant Afanasyevo-related ancestry, no Bactria margiana signature, no trace of a recent arrival from the West at all. Their genomes were instead dominated by an ancient North Eurasian-related lineage, with additional ancient Northeast Asian ancestry mixed in. They weren't migrants. They represented a long, isolated local population, genetically distinct, living in the Tarim Basin by the early Bronze Age, despite the arrival of steppe pastoralists elsewhere in Xinjiang. Here's the twist that made the story stranger instead of simpler, the part no one had predicted going in when the samples went into the sequencer. The Dzungarian Basin individuals, buried in the same region just a few centuries earlier, told the opposite story. Their ancestry carried substantial Afanasyevo-related genetics, consistent with long-standing hypotheses linking later Indo-European, possibly Tocharian, expansions to the region. So the steppe migrants were real, but the earliest people buried in the Xiaohe boat coffins were not the steppe migrants many researchers had imagined. Circle back to the tall stature, the fair complexions, the hair running light brown to blonde, the traits that had convinced so many researchers. None of it was evidence of the Western migration many had inferred from it. What the Tarim people did do was adopt, and that turns out to be the more interesting story. Zheng's team found milk proteins embedded in dental calculus from individuals at Xiaohe, direct evidence of dairy pastoralism, alongside wheat, barley, and herding practices that all point west culturally, without a matching migration to explain them. Ideas and technologies moved into the Tarim Basin. The population that received them remained genetically distinct while adopting them. The cheese buried with them tells the same story, in more detail than anyone expected. In 2003, archaeologists excavated a coffin holding a young woman with strange yellowish lumps scattered across her neck and chest, laid out almost like jewelry, as if someone had dressed her body in food for whatever came next. In 2014, researcher Yimin Yang and colleagues ran proteomics analysis on the residue and identified it as kefir cheese, fermented from cow and goat milk, roughly 3,600 years old, the oldest cheese ever directly dated anywhere in the archaeological record. A decade later, in 2024, a team led by Chinese Academy of Sciences paleogeneticist Xiaohe Fu went further still, sequencing the actual bacterial DNA preserved inside it, dry and dense as stone after all that time instead of soft. The fermentation microbe turned out to be more closely related to strains still used in Tibet today than to the North Caucasus lineage long credited as kefir's birthplace, evidence of cultural contact stretching across the Bronze Age without requiring anyone to have physically migrated from where those cultures began. That may be the real lesson sitting inside a 4,000-year-old mummy's grave goods, more interesting than the migration story it replaced. Cultures don't only spread because people move, and sometimes they spread because ideas do, carried along trade routes by people who never left home at all. That ancient lineage didn't disappear either. A 2022 study in molecular biology and evolution found this same isolated ancestry still detectable today, specifically among highland Tajik communities living in the Pamir Mountains bordering the Tarim Basin, a living trace of a population once mistaken for migrants who, it turns out, barely went anywhere at all. They weren't migrants wearing the wrong desert's clothing. They were the region's own people, adaptive without ever leaving, misread for 2 decades by everyone looking at the wrong kind of evidence.